Again, thank you for joining us today for this fifth session of the 2019 AgrAbility Virtual National Training Workshop. Today's session, the first session today, is on accessible farm shops. And our presenter is Dr. Sean Ehlers, and he is the Technology Outreach Coordinator for the National AgrAbility Project. If you're not familiar with AgrAbility, we are a program that's sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Every AgrAbility project is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. There are currently 20 funded projects around the country in terms of state projects. There's one national AgrAbility project, and that's led through the Breaking New Ground Resource Center here at Purdue University. Our partners on that grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, APRIL, which is the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. If you'd like more information about AgrAbility, feel free to explore agrability.org. In addition to our archived webinars, there are a variety of different resources on that site. So again, we would welcome your interaction through the website. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Ehlers. I'm going to mute my microphone and turn off my camera and return during the polling and question and answer.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul, and welcome everybody and thank you for taking the time to join us today to talk about accessible farm shops. I'm Sean Ehlers, and as Paul said, I'm the AgrAbility Technology Outreach Coordinator here for the National Project. So the presentation today, each topic we have here is basically a presentation in itself. So we will be doing some skimming over the top, but please, collect your questions, and I'm happy to answer as many as you have at the end of the presentation. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit of the structure of the farm shop, what some things to consider, windows, doors, the building size, and then all the walls and floors, so, types of coatings that we have and options there. Electrical is always important. Farm shops are very reliant on their electrical systems, so we do want to pay close attention when we start designing or recommending electrical products in the shop. All shops need water and air, compressed air. It's just very common, and farming has a lot of lifting to it, so we'll talk a little bit about lifting and how to make things a little bit more accessible. Lastly, we're going to talk about some accommodating the climate. So here in Indiana, we have some really cold temperatures right now, and so it wouldn't be very fun to work in a shop if it wasn't heated, and that's true for many parts of the Midwest and throughout the country this time of year. And lastly, we're going to talk about our workspaces and what we can do to kind of maximize our safety, productivity, and efficiency. So planning is always kind of our first step here. And designing and modifying a shop capable to meet really the person's needs for today as well as future needs. And that involves a lot of forethought. And even though we put a lot of time in this step, we still might need to make some modifications as time progresses. So really what we're looking at here is we need to start asking questions about what gives you difficulty now, or the more difficult question to ask, and it's not always foreseeable, is what will give me difficulty in the future? So here's the first question we need to think about. If you're an established farm, you probably already have a farm shop or someplace that you perform maintenance and store equipment. If you're new or changing your operation a little bit, maybe you need to be looking at a new type of facility. So the first question we look at is, do we renovate or do we start new? There's a lot of questions to really ask here, but basically it's going to come down to the existing structure and kind of doing a cost-benefit analysis on, how much will it cost me to basically get what I need out of my my shop, or will it just be better to kind of start with a clean slate and be a little bit more suitable than retrofitting a building. So there's a lot to consider, and hopefully we kind of spark some interest and thoughts as we go through here. Some benefits we do have with looking at a new building include things like making it large enough so you have adequate space. You can incorporate the latest technologies such as energy efficiency, such as lights or insulations or building materials. And we can also talk about the needs to grow in the future. So we can think about that when it comes time to build or modify. So really the first place we start here is with the basic structure itself. And the first question that a contractor will ask you is, what size building do you need? And so this takes, some consideration. Are you going to use it for storage? Are we going to use it for maintenance? Are we going to do both? Shops that were built 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago is, really ag equipment has changed considerably, and they might not meet the needs that we have today. So we do have a lot of things that to consider here. Some afterthoughts that people typically have after building a building is, well, gosh, did I not build it large enough? Can I store all my equipment in here? What if I expand or get larger in the future? Some people kind of regret not going with a larger door size. When it's very overwhelming when it comes time to build one of these buildings, because there's so many decisions to make. You're trying to be typically frugal. You want to have the biggest bang for your buck, but you also want to be considerate about what's going to be the best for you and your work moving forward. So door size, width, and height is always a big one. Equipment has gotten fairly large here in modern days, and so we have to think about that. Electrical receptacles, things as simple as electrical receptacles, is typically an afterthought that it's like, gosh, I should have put more of those in my building, because we want to focus on safety and accessibility, and part of that deals with, and I'll mention several times in presentation, reducing trip hazards. So if we don't have enough receptacles in a building, we tend to use extension cords, and they create trip hazards, and we want to be as safe as we can for ourselves and our clients when we make these types of recommendations. And receptacles are very cheap. We'll talk about this when we get to the electrical section a little bit more. Lighting is a really big part of this. So the quantity and the output of light. As we get older, we need more light to see the same things that we did when we were younger. So typically you don't hear anybody complain, after they build a building. It's like, wow, I put too many lights in that building. It's too bright. So that's not really a complaint you hear very often. Other things we look at are like floor drains and windows and doors and things like that. So we'll cover a lot of these topics as we move forward here. So sticking with the structure, one of the things that we consider is the height of the building. Building up is often the least expensive gain to shop volume, meaning that we can gain more space of a building by going up. This unlocks some hidden storage that we can add. Sometimes many shops do like an upper level in part of it for inventory storage, because we have a lot of parts and filters and things like that don't really need to be on the main shop floor. And that's some valuable space that we can free up. And we can also do placement of remote tools, such as air compressors and things like that they don't really need to be on that main shop floor, because you're not interacting with the air compressor. We have plumbing throughout the building for our airline. So height is very important when we talk about that here. Most row crop shops, we tend to see 16 to 18 foot eaves. And this allows the taller equipment to get in, and the interior dimensions of the building or heights will either meet that or exceed that, because depending on the type of door, we'll need additional height for that door to either roll up into the ceiling or depending on how it opens. Also, some farm shops, they like to have a taller height inside so they can unfold or do maintenance on different types of equipment, such as a combine. Many combines have collapsible grain tanks, so they can actually unfold those in taller buildings if they ever need to do any maintenance there. Length and width of the building. So this is going to be very farm specific on what your needs are, but you need to consider just when we make this decision, what's the width of my largest machine? Do I need to work on it when it's unfolded, the implement? Do I have enough depth to fully pull in my machinery with an implement in tow? You see this often when we talk about grain producers, and if it's poor weather conditions, they want to pull in a semi or grain wagons or something. And when we get in and out of vehicles a lot to unhook, and we just create more potential for injuries and things like that. So we need to consider how deep the building needs to be to pull in our equipment, or if that's something we need to do. This could just be a maintenance shop and you're not going to do any storage in it. So a lot of things to consider here. Typically shops will put their largest doors in the side walls of the building, but this does change. Depends on kind of the layout and the needs of the shop. So this is just, look at, I guess my biggest piece of advice here is look at a lot of examples and see what you think will work best for you. Remodeling is much more cost effective when we add length rather than width to a building. So when we add length to a building, we just can add additional trusses to extend the length of the building. But to add a width to a building, this gets a little bit more costly, because we actually have to modify the truss system for each truss in that building, and it costs quite a bit more. So it's worth your time to really get it right the first time on the width of a building. Length can, like I said, be added on to later. Windows and doors. So there are so many options to talk about here, but some key items we want to point out is let's look at the level of energy efficiency, because these are big doors, and it can let in a lot of cold air in the wintertime or heat in the summertime. So energy efficiency, so we look at insulated versus uninsulated doors. Light transmission. Many of our overhead doors or walk-through doors have windows, so it's nice to get that added light when we're working on things in there to assist us. Opening style, I'm going to cover this on the next slide, but there are so many types of door openings that you really need to kind of look to see what fits you best. And then dimensions, like I mentioned on the previous slides. There are a lot of dimensions we can look at, and this really comes down to your size of operation and size of equipment and machinery. So the three types of doors that we look at here, or openings, are machinery doors, walk-through doors, and windows. So first, here I have just a comparison table of machinery doors, and there's just a couple points. Basically what I have here is ascending order of cost. So sliding track door, fairly inexpensive. They're kind of the door that comes on most shops and buildings and storage buildings. They're not quite as tight, so weather tight, and they can be difficult to move manually. So if the person has a mobility impairment, it's something that's a little bit more difficult for them to open and close. They're heavy. Now, with that being said, there are products available that can motorize the opening of a sliding track door. But there's a lot of considerations here. Side hinge doors, so these are limited in width, and as you can imagine, if you have a really wide door, it puts a lot of strain on the hinges, and basically you can't have anything in front of it or it won't be able to open. Overhead doors are very common that we see on shops, the segmented style. This is typically what we have on our houses, our garages. One downside to an overhead door style is that it does decrease ceiling clearance when we have this style inside a shop. So you just have to think about the height of our eaves and height of our equipment that will be on the inside. And then the most expensive option typically is the single or bifold hydraulic door. They do have benefits to them though, and one of them, I'll go back one slide, is you can see in this picture, it actually puts an awning when it's up over part of the apron on the outside of the shop. So if it's a nice day, you don't need to be like confined inside the building, or you're doing something that has fumes, you can actually have a little cover over top of you while using this type of door. So there's just a few things to consider when we're looking at main machinery entry doors. Walk-through doors are going to be probably the most used ones in the shop. And we need to consider three things here. The accessibility, so how easy they are to get in, or the person that, are they able to, like threshold height, things like that. Energy efficiency, and their level of security. So security is always a big thing. We have a lot of expensive tools and components and chemicals that we store in the shop, store on the farm. And so security is something that should be on our mind when we're making recommendations and designs here. What I typically recommend is an exterior rated insulated door with a window. Window just makes it a little bit easier that you can see what's on the other side. Now this isn't quite as good for security reasons, but it does allow a little light in, and so you have to weigh your pros and cons here. I really like using programmable keypad deadbolts. They're not super expensive, but they're really nice because when I'm in a tractor all day, I don't carry a lot of keys with me. So it's nice just to have a combination and a code to punch in and to get into the shop at the end of the day. And so that's nice to not really have to carry those keys with me. A few things to consider here are the ADA recommendations, and these are great to follow. And I have a couple example pictures here to follow this slide. But basically we want a minimum width of a 36-inch door. We want a nice level landing area in front of the door if the person has some mobility impairments. That gives them some space to maneuver. Lever-style door handles are easier to operate, and they're also nice if you have things in your hands. It's a little bit easier to open that way as well. I've recommended for several clients remote automatic door openers. So if they have a power chair or anything like that, they can just push a button and the door will open into their shop, and it makes it a little bit easier for them to get in. And here's the last one that's typically one of the more difficult ones to kind of retrofit, but the threshold height, to make it a little bit easier to get in, we want to look at something less than a ½ inch. So here's a client's building that had a new concrete pad poured on the side entry door and also on their overhead door. So if you look closely at the side entry door, I'll try to draw a box if it shows up. There we go. Look at that nice threshold, and it's pretty low. It's easy for somebody to get in, and if they have a manual or electric chair. And there is plenty of concrete space to maneuver and turn. Okay, so we talked about machinery doors, we talked about entry doors, and now we're going to talk a little bit about windows. Numerous windows are great. There's no substitute for natural light when you're working on things. It's nice to place workbenches and things of sort in front of these windows, and it's just very convenient. And the other thing is it allows us to get some extra ventilation in the summer months, and also if we have to exhaust any fumes that we're creating by working on something. Say we're doing some painting or any cleaning of parts, anything like that. We can open some doors and windows to kind of get those harmful fumes out of there. I always recommend going with an Energy Star rated door. On a personal note, this is one of my buildings here in the picture. When we built this, half of this building was a farm shop, and the other half was just machinery storage. And we thought we would just save a little money and put regular single pane windows in the storage side and have our double pane Energy Star windows in the shop side, because that side would be heated. Well, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at what the building costs and you just save a few $100s by going with the single pane windows, it wasn't really worth it. And so hindsight's 20/20, and so I do recommend going with those double pane windows to really improve your efficiency should you ever decide to heat it. Okay, floors. Floors are important. There's a lot of things to consider on flooring. Typically we use concrete, reinforced concrete when we pour a floor of a shop. And there's several factors here. So thickness is very important because most ag machinery is fairly heavy, and so we don't want to cause any cracks or stress fractures in the building. So first thing we talk about or consider when we're talking about pouring a concrete floor is the thickness. And then next we worry or consider is the surface texture. So we can do what's called a brushed texture, and that's basically after they pour the concrete, they smooth it, and then they drag a stiff bristled brush over it, and that really gives the texture kind of like a sandpaper type. It's very grippy. The downside to this is that brush texture can collect dirt and isn't quite as easy to sweep when it comes time to clean the shop. But it's very nice if you have a wash bay, and anything outside should be a brush finish. So surface texture is something that you need to consider or at least mention. And then surface treatment. So there are a lot of sprays or sealers that we can put on concrete. They do very well in resisting oil and different things that can collect or soak into the concrete. So treatment is very good. Now, something to watch out for these treatments is the potential to make a smooth concrete pad very slick if it ever gets wet or oils or anything on it, because oil is going to sit on top of that treated or sealed concrete and create a pretty hazardous area there. So it has its pros and cons, I'll say that. We need to maintain the quality of our concrete, so I will mention that here on the next couple slides. We'll see some pictures of what I'm referring to here. But basically we're talking about cutting expansion joints into the concrete slab after it's poured to relieve any stress as the ground settles or ever have any shifting or anything. And basically what we're doing here is we're directing those cracks where we want them to be instead of them choosing their own path. And so that keeps the quality of the concrete pad good over a very long period of time. Moisture issues. This is sometimes a biggie in farm shops, especially if they don't have any type of climate control in them. So typically we put down a vapor barrier before we pour the concrete, and this can prevent some moistures coming up through the ground or anything like that, and really stop some of that movement. So you don't really think about this, but concrete is porous and moisture can move up through it. And when we get sweating through the concrete, when we have climate changing from winter to spring, this introduces moisture into the shop. It can cause mildew, mold, rust of tools, all that kind of thing. So we want to cut down on that as much as we can, and one way to do that is by putting a vapor barrier in the concrete. And lastly, drainage. So we want to maintain proper slope for the drainage inside the shop, and we want to have some drains in the shop. So I've seen shops where they have not put drains in before, and if you pull something in the winter time, or if it's a rainy day, or even if you're just washing off a piece of equipment, you want to have someplace for that water to go. So properly sloped to a drain is quite important. So we have a couple of pictures to go through here, and I'll go through fairly fast. I want to point out a few things. So if you look at this area here, this is a site that's prepped for and it's ready to be poured. So this is the day before this was poured. So I'm going to point out a couple things. I just drew two boxes right there and there, and you see that it's a little bit deeper in these two spots. So for this shop, the owner planned ahead and thought that they would one day want to add some type of lift or a gantry crane or anything like that that would be mounted into the concrete, and he spoke with the contractor, a concrete contractor, and basically what they did, they just dug out a couple areas to make it extra deep and to really increase that rigidity and anchoring point for the lift. So basically this concrete pad is poured 5 inches thick everywhere except for right here, and they added an extra 4 inches, so we have a 9 or 10 inch concrete pad in these 2 areas. Next thing I want to point out is off to the left here, we have a long drain. So this drain's put in and they laser leveled it to get the slope correct. And this is a very long trough style drain. And these are kind of the style that I would recommend for any shop. And we'll talk about these in a slide or two. And then lastly, the thing I mentioned on the previous slide is this roll right here. This is our rolled up plastic, which is our vapor barrier to prevent or reduce any of the any moisture movement through the concrete and reduce some of that sweating when we have temperature changes with the seasons. So here's the shop, same picture, the same shop from the previous slide after it's poured. And what they just did here is I'll draw a couple boxes, and they cut in their expansion joints. So typically we want to put expansion joints every 8 to 10 foot through the building. And like I said earlier, this just kind of maintains the quality of the concrete. And should there ever be any shifting or settling, we can direct the cracks to hopefully follow this and instead of making their own path. Here's a shop for a client who had a new apron poured, and something I want you to take note of is right here, the entry into the shop. So there's a little lip here. It's about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch lip, and what this does, this keeps like when it rains and things, it keeps water from ever wanting to flow into the building, but it's low enough for easy entry, especially somebody with mobility impairments. So that is a great thing to keep in mind and recommend whenever we look at or look to add, an outdoor service area or apron. Okay, so we're moving on. We've got the structure, we talked about height, we talked about windows and doors and concrete. So now we're going to talk about the walls and ceilings. And so there are a lot of options here. Commonly used in farm shops, we see wood, which is typically plywood, OSB, or pegboard, and sometimes a combination of the 3. Pegboard is nice because we can actually add some tool storage to that. Other common materials are metal, drywall, and vinyl. Metal is wonderful. It's durable. It can get wet. Drywall is less expensive. It goes up easier, but it's a little bit more prone to having, if you ever bump a piece of machinery or anything, it's a little more susceptible to damage and water damage. And vinyl, just like you see on the outside of houses, vinyl siding is great to put in places like if you're ever going to have a wash bay or someplace to maintain equipment in that manner. So each material has its attributes that are great and ideal for shops, and then they also have their cons and drawbacks to them. So things to consider, and just you got to look to see what's most relevant to you. But cost is always a big one. That's always on the forefront of mine and customers or clients' minds. Ease of cleaning. So shops are dirty. We want to have something that's easy to clean. We want something that reflects light. So typically we want something that's very bright white in color. So that's kind of a downside to going with the wood, plywood, and OSB, unless we paint it. But in this picture here to the right, we have a bright white metal wall, and that's really nice for reflecting some light, and it's easy to clean. Sound deadening is the downside to metal walls. They do make sometimes, it's called a perforated metal wall. So basically there's little dots or holes punched out into the metal, and it kind of allows the sound to not all of it bounce off of the metal. Some of it will get absorbed in the insulation behind it. But I've been in shops like this, and they're still pretty noisy. When owner has an impact wrench or air compressor running or any type of machinery like that, it can get pretty noisy in there. So a lot of things to consider here. Fire resistance is very important, so if you have an area of the shop that you do welding or cutting with a torch or grinding, anything like that, really pay close attention to materials that are fire resistant. So here we have a picture of a shop that has two different types of walls on it. So most of the walls in this shop are actually drywall, but this is the shop that I mentioned earlier that had a partition in it. And half of the shop was storage, the other half was actually a service area. And so we have drywall on one wall and we have metal on the partition wall. The other thing I want you to draw your attention to is notice how the lights in this shop are actually mounted on the wall. They're mounted about 1.5 feet down. And this is using that white ceiling to actually cause some glare and cast light down in multiple angles. So basically the light is projecting straight out and up, and when it reflects off the ceiling, it kind of casts less shadows. So you see this sometimes in like body shops when they are working on paint and things. But it's also very helpful in farm shops because when we have tall equipment, if the light is mounted in the ceiling, then we cast a lot of shadows. So that's something to consider when we're looking at lighting and placement. Here's a different method. So here's a shop that has all the lighting in the ceiling. But this is a new type of lighting. So basically what we have here are fluorescent replacement bulbs that are LED. So these were conventional fluorescent fixtures. And what we did, we replaced these with 36 quantity. There's 36 LED light bulbs, or fixtures, light bulbs in this the shop. These provide a huge amount of light. It's very bright. And all 36 of these together use about 600 watts of energy, of electricity total. So that's about half of what a hairdryer uses. So very energy efficient. And we also think about the light. So if we have somebody with mobility impairments, they're not going to want to climb a ladder to change the light bulb. And these have a 50,000 hour life to them. So that is something that's really key to look at. Okay, electrical. So there's a lot to talk about electrical. We could do the whole presentation on electrical, but I'll just go through a few things here. Basically, it's great to have a licensed electrician come and do the electrical, but you want to have an idea of what you need to kind of guide the electrician in their work. The three basic components we look for here are dedicated electrical components. So these are things that have a dedicated circuit or a dedicated breaker to them. So things like an air conditioner, a heater, air compressor, large air compressor, or a welder. And then we have our conventional, like 110 volt regular wall receptacles. Please do not skimp on these if you're building a new building. They are inexpensive. You can buy a contractor pack, and they're less than $1 a piece. So put a lot of these along the walls, and you will not regret it. Interior and exterior lighting is the third part of our electrical system. We want to avoid trip hazards. So extension cords are kind of bad when we're talking about safety and accessibility. So they are quite the trip hazard. So if you see in this picture here, we have drop-down ceiling cords. These are great, and they hit the cords up off the ground. Like I mentioned earlier, receptacles are fairly inexpensive, so put a lot of them in there. And we like our very bright and efficient lighting. So we see that in the picture as well. We can talk a little bit about security here. And this shop has motion lights on it that have a high and low to them. So basically they're on all the time as a security light. And if they detect motion, then they go to bright, which you see here. And then they turn off when the sun comes up. So they're dusk to dawn. They have a light sensor to them. So this is great for if you have a long day and coming in to either park or work in the shop later in the evening. We can also do supplemental lighting inside the shop over like a work area. And here we have a 10,000 lumen LED light over a workspace. And this is basically a replacement for a halogen light, only it uses 1/5 the electricity and doesn't have the heat associated with it either. Okay, air compressors. Compressed air is very important in our farm shops, so we want to place that air compressor in a, someplace that's out of the way, but we want to have the plumbing convenient to access throughout the shop. So considerations we have are the tank size, so how much, basically the larger the tank, the less frequency the compressor has to turn on, how much power or pressure we need here, and how much electrical power you need there. Air lines, this is something we really want to draw attention to, what the air lines are plumbed out of the material throughout the shop. Do not use, and always point out if you see somebody using PVC pipe to do this. PVC gets brittle with time, and you can get a crack, and it can basically throw shards of plastic. It can be very dangerous. So we do not want to ever see PVC plastic. In the picture here, you see copper tubing, and that's one great option. Water supply. So we want to have water for machine maintenance and personal health. Considerations, this really goes to the building code for the area, but some things to think about is the burial depth, the placement of the hydrant. So we don't want to have hoses everywhere, maybe use a hose reel, and the floor slope inside the building and the drain size. So these are things that we want to watch for here when we're talking about our water removal and water coming into the building. So here's 3 floor drain types. The one on the left is plastic trough, but this is nice because it kind of resists clogging. It's great for agricultural operations, and this one can support the weight of heavy machinery. The other thing that can support heavy machinery is the top right, which is a steel grate, or the bottom right corner. You see sometimes in shops, but I don't really recommend these. They can break under high loads such as large tractors. So try to stay away from the plastic tile on the bottom right. Overhead lifting. So we have a lot of options here for lifting, parts, equipment, to work on machinery. There are a lot of lifting devices. They have gantry cranes, jib cranes, 2-post and 4-post hoists, and engine hoists. And these make it easy to unload things from vehicles or work on machinery. Here we have a lawnmower being serviced. I've serviced mowers, like bush hogs, and all kinds of equipment. It makes it very nice for servicing. One note to note here at the bottom is make sure whatever lift type they use that it has some type of interlock to prevent any type of inadvertent lowering that can cause injury or death. So this is the type of crane or overhead gantry crane that we see in larger agricultural shops, and basically it's an I-beam with a trolley and an electric winch on the top, and so we can do a lot of work and save our backs by using products like this in our shops. Okay, so now we're getting to heating and cooling. This time of year we think of heating, so heat always flows from warm zones to cool zones. Proper insulation will decrease this flow. So insulating a shop properly to begin with will save you money in the long run. And certain clients, have more susceptibility to hot and cold conditions, and this might be, something that they really need to look at. Also, we need to have vapor barriers and sufficient insulation. This will also reduce to less condensation. It can cause mold, mildew, and corrosion of tools and stored materials. Several methods to heat a shop. On the top left, we have in-floor radiant heating. So this is put down before the concrete is poured over top of it. It can be either electric or hot water pumped through pipes to heat the concrete slab. Very nice. It's more effective in larger buildings than small buildings. It's not quite as price effective. We have radiant heat in the top right picture, and this is one that goes a tube style that just goes the width of the building, and it radiates down. The problem with this style is if you have really tall machinery, you can imagine the top of a cab of a tractor is pretty close to this, And so that's just something to watch out for. And then the very bottom picture is a forced air heater that just blows out the hot air and exhausts the exhaust out the back of the building. So we can go to the U.S. government Department of Energy page. This gives us some ideas of how much insulation to actually use and going by your climatic zone. So here in Indiana, we're in a zone 5, and we feel like we're in a zone 7 today. But you know, this will tell us how much insulation is recommended for us. So there's several different types. We have blown-in, loose-filled fiberglass, which is the top left. This is being blown in the attic or the ceiling. We also have, that's the most expensive and best, but it can be cost prohibitive, is expanding foam insulation, which is the top right. The bottom left is actually blown-in insulation that's put behind a blanket for sidewalls. So this is a very good method. And then we have our fiberglass bats that you see in the bottom right. Okay, last topic that we're rounding up here. So workspaces. So we have different workspaces. We have places to actually work on machinery. We have our workbenches, and then we have our standalone tools and storage areas. So basically, we want to maintain a margin around our workspaces, at least 3 foot, preferably 5 foot, so we have room to walk and maneuver around here. Tools and workbench height should be comfortable for the worker, so this could be either a standing workbench or a sitting workbench. So we typically like to go or follow the ADA guides. It's a great reference in this for this case. Other thing we want to consider here in our workspaces is really the progression of the work being done. So basically what I'm saying here is we need to group the items adjacent to each other as they're needed. So an example I have is we might want to have like some metal stock or storage in a storage area, and then adjacent to that we would do our rough cutting. So just kind of cut it down to the basic size it needs, so it would be adjacent to that. And then we move on to our finer details, so this could be like a drill press or a mill or anything like that. And then we kind of finish with the assembly area. So it's nice to have kind of a linear progression when we think about our workspaces and design. Another great thing about workspaces are mobile tool carts. I use these all the time in my farm shop. I use them to just store the common tools that I need, and I also use them to either you know, take parts or move parts around in the shop. It reduces the trips you take, and also you don't have to carry a lot of heavy parts. You can use it as a service, as a cart as well. Organization is key. I love to see an organized shop. It makes it more efficient, and it's also great for vision impairments. So when tools have their dedicated location, it's easier to find, you know, when you need them and you know, the exact tool you need. So this kind of comes into the labeling of parts, tools, and chemicals. Anyways, and lastly, we had down here slips and trip hazards. So this is what we want to avoid. We don't want to have a shop that's just very cluttered and you know, it'd be nearly impossible to walk through this shop without tripping over something. And so we want to avoid those secondary injuries. Same way here. They have workspace, but it's very cluttered and unorganized. So this is what I'm talking about on the tool cart. It's nice. It can be, you know, it's small. It can be kind of pushed over to whatever you're working on, and you have your common tools that you need at your fingertips, and you're not really kind of walking around the shop and looking for everything that you need. And also, you can use the top to carry the part over and just kind of keep it nearby. It's a great organization. Here's another thing to continue on organization is wall storage. Several tools here that we recommend in the AgrAbility toolbox. And one of them, I'll just take one quick second, is this one right here. This is actually a new tool that we've added to the toolbox here recently. This is a impact wrench. It's battery powered. So we see that a lot of clients have trouble, you know, using a pneumatic impact wrench because even getting the chuck on the airline on can be difficult. So this is lighter and it has similar torque as a pneumatic impact wrench and is very mobile. So having tools easily accessible just makes efficiency and working on things much nicer. Here we go. Everything has its place. you know when it's missing, and it's easy to find the tool you want, especially for vision impaired clients. The very last thing we're going to touch on here is safety and security. We always want to have a method of communication. So cell phone typically is what we use here. We need fire extinguishers, especially in areas of increased potential for an incident, such as welding, torches, or grinding areas. We need to have a space to store our PPE, or personal protective equipment, such as masks or safety glasses, because if we're walking around looking for safety glasses, odds are the client probably isn't going to use it if it takes a huge amount of effort to find something. So we want those to be readily available and easily stored to find them when they need them. Identify hazards and store flammable contents in a cabinet, and you can identify the cabinet. And we always want to have working smoke alarms and carbon monoxide. Air quality is always big, so we talked about this when we talked about windows. We can actually do venting if you do a lot of engine work to actually vent out the exhaust fumes. And if you do work that has a lot of dust associated with it, a dust collector is wonderful. I'll touch on that on the next slide. Security, we've already mentioned the keyless deadbolts. They're great for locking up shops. Large overhead doors can also be locked with the same technology. This is something becoming a little bit more popular now. Motion lights, we discussed this earlier. And another thing is camera systems. They're becoming much less expensive, and they can alert the farm operator if anybody is there or you know, doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So this is great for our high-value products and tools that we often see in the shop. Dust collectors can be quite expensive. Here's a neat add-on for a shop vac, because most shops have a shop vac. And this one is low cost. I think it's $35. And basically what this does, it has a cyclone action to it. It collects 99% of the dust before it ever gets to the shop vac. So you're not clogging up the filter in the shop vac. You're just using the vac for its vacuum, and then all the dust is collected in this 5-gallon bucket. So you can see your before and after, or the setup there to the right. Here's the deadbolt that I was mentioning that's becoming more popular for overhead doors. So this is actually plugged in. You see the wire coming out of the top of it right here. That actually goes to the overhead door motor. So when you hit the button to open the door, it sends a signal to this, and it retracts that deadbolt, and it keeps anybody from ever, you know, trying to pry up a door. So security is something that we're seeing more and more of an issue, especially with the high value of tools and products. So here's our conclusion. We really need these shops to really accommodate the needs and of the workers to create a safe, accessible, and efficient working space. It's great to talk to neighbors or go to a dealership, speak with AgrAbility and ATPs to spark ideas. And really the last message we need to leave here is that your shop should work for you. And you know, it's kind of a play on words, but it needs to be something that you know, is more conducive to the work that you're doing. So thank you. I'll pass this back to Paul, and if you have any questions, here's my contact information. While Paul's getting this up, I would like to put a plug in for a new plowshares that is coming out. So Dick Brzezowski and I work together. Dick is main AgrAbility. And so everything you've seen here is basically pulled from a plowshares that is coming out hopefully this spring. And so I wanted to say stay tuned, that will be here soon. So it's a little bit more detailed than me flying through it in this presentation. But anyway, just wanted to say that. Okay, so we have a question here. So, are there any smart products that can be useful in shops, either tools or security devices? Well, there are. There are a lot of things that we can do. There's a lot of things like Alexa or Amazon products. You can actually do smart plugs, so you can have it turn on and off shop tools or anything. Say you wanted to turn on a dust collector. Other things that we have are reminder type smart tools. So if you forget and leave the shop door open, it can actually send a text to your phone and say, hey, your door's open. Do you want this to be the way it is? Other things are door locks. We see these frequently, especially if we're getting any deliveries like seeds or chemicals, high value products. You can unlock a door and allow the delivery to come, actually place it inside the building. So there's a lot of smart tools. Others have to do with like hand tools. So certain brands have actually come out with locating devices. So if you go away from, like if you leave a tool someplace, it'll actually alert you. So it has like a proximity. So that one's kind of neat. And there are some smartphone type tools that we have in the toolbox, or it's in the process of being added to the toolbox. So these are things like inspection cameras, moisture meters. There's a few others there that's kind of flipping my mind, but I guess we're in the era right now of smart products, so there's probably a lot more to come. Your mic isn't on. Mike.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Checking the camera here, or the chat, and it doesn't look like we have more right now. So we thank you for your participation, and we hope that you will join us this afternoon for our final session. Have a good day.